already 10 o'clock, so we are already many. Thank you so much. We start the second session of the eBMS coordinator meeting. This session is, we are going to talk about the power analysis Moth monitoring done by Chris and Swaay, and then later it will follow Reto with use of Shiny eBMS and more about formatting data and summary statistics. So I think it will be really interesting. So welcome everyone. And you can switch off the cameras now or the microphones, and then maybe later I give you time for asking questions. And then you can ask whatever you want. So Chris, should we start?
Yeah, I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay, well, I've been talking, more on the Moth monitoring and the power analysis is one bit of that. So it will be also because I think Moth monitoring is a very promising new concept, which we should try to roll out all over Europe. So the presentation I give is also was mainly made actually by Irma for the spring meeting. I adapted some things and changed some things, and I give today's presentation. So I think for us it's all quite clear that moths are important as pollinators, though the real scientific research showing that is relatively recent. So a good paper showing how important moths are as pollinators, and there are all kinds of papers nowadays available showing how important they are. And this makes a difference because we need such papers to show the importance and also to be able to integrate moths into the pollinator monitoring, which is starting to all over Europe and the EU. So what is the basic idea with monitoring? Well, it's actually very comparable with the butterfly monitoring. So first of all, we have fixed locations. It's the same as you have a transect, which you walk every week. In our case, you use the same trap. It doesn't have to be the same trap everywhere, but I mean, you use the same trap on one location. You do it regularly, once a week or once every 2 weeks. I come back to that later, what is needed. It's also important to standardize the length of the trapping. So what we principally do is trap the whole night. An ID can be done the next morning. You can make photos of all the moths inside, which is good to save for future analysis or identification, but you can also use the AI, which is also available. And so if you try to keep the effort constant, same sites, same trap in time, the changes in theory should come from changes in the number of moths on the site. And if we have lots of sites, we can combine them, and just like with the butterfly monitoring, calculate trends in the moth species. So this is something you might have done. It's a really great way of getting a view on what moths are in the region. But for moth monitoring, this is not a good method because the effort depends on how many people are there. If you go home at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, all this matters because moths are not all moths fly the whole night. Some moths are very typical for the beginning of the night, some others for the end of the night. So we should try to standardize the effort. And principally, you can use any trap as long as you always keep the same trap at the site. So in a garden where you have electricity on the left upper side, this is a standard Skinner trap, which works on electricity in this case. But there are also other traps, like the one in the middle, which is extremely cheap. I think it just costs 15 euro or so, made of a cola bottle. We haven't tested it, so we don't know if it's, but it was on the internet, and I thought it was actually an interesting idea. And the right side, the right photo, you see the traps we have tested and we have used in the past in the Netherlands and in the rest of Europe in the Spring project. So I will tell a little bit more about this LED trap. It's also relatively cheap, though not as cheap as the cola bottle type. It is not very powerful, but which is principally a good idea because it tracks especially moths in the direct surroundings of the trap. We have done tests and it doesn't get very much further than 15 to 20 meters. That's more or less what your maximum attraction normally is. So it works on a sensor and a power bank, so it switches on in the evening and switches off in the morning. Also because it's the light is not very powerful, it's not very notable. And the whole idea is that you photograph the moths inside. Of course, if you know all the species, you can also count them. But if you are not familiar with all the species, you can photograph the moths. They can be either stored for later identification by experts, or you can use the AI for identification, but also then experts can always check in the end. That's the big advantage when there are photos of each moth, and which is usually fairly simple because in the early morning, when the moths are relatively quiet, they sit and can be photographed. They are light, which also means that we use it for all kinds of field work because you can easily transport 10 or 20 traps if needed in a little, I don't know how it's called, behind your bike anyway. They are light, you can easily walk with them into the field and put them on several locations. There's a manual how to use it in several languages, so also another languages translated where you can see exactly how you should at least use this type of traps. And the nice thing about this trap is that anybody can join. And this is an example of farmers in the Netherlands who we have a special project in which farmers monitor the moths on their field and on their near their house. So we have, well, I must also admit there are a lot of farmers' wives who join, more than farmers actually, but still. And one of the great things they also mention is that in the morning it's always a real party with the children to open the trap and to see what's inside. So they really are very enthusiastic cooperators. Actually, in some of these places, there is also an automatic trap from Naturalis, but the farmers are all very negative on that. Not because it doesn't work, but that's just the machine recording the moths. And once every 3 weeks, somebody from Naturalis used to come and collect SD card, and now it's even done by 4G, so they don't see anybody. And this is always great to see the moths. And we find it also important as Dutch butterfly conservation because it's important that the farmers start realizing the biodiversity on their land and start appreciating biodiversity. And of course, like this, opening the box with your family and children is simply great fun and learns you about what's going on. So these traps, in some nights you can have big numbers. I'll come back to that later. And it's simply fun for everybody to open them and make photos and record them. So yeah, get all kinds of moths. Even in the Netherlands, it can be quite fun because even in the Netherlands, a very poor country for most things, we have still 2,400 species of moths. The Butterfly Count app can also be used for moth monitoring. It's one of the options. And actually the AI is built in. It's the AI from observations from Naturalis, which was a partner in the Spring project. There are more AIs, but and you can use, for example, the one from observation from iNaturalist. But that one is not built in, so you would have to do that manually. In this case, it means that if you use the app and you have internet connection, you photograph the moths, it will immediately start identifying the moths and trying to count them because you make several photos, one photo for each moth. And that's a way to to easily do it, even if you're not very familiar with the moths. In Northwestern Europe, the AI is quite good, but it's of course less outside Northwestern Europe because the observation.org was developed with Northwestern European photos, especially. iNaturalist is probably better in the rest of Europe, but like I said, it's not built in. You would have to do it manually, but that's also an option. Of course, it means that reliable moth monitoring is possible by citizens, even with little knowledge of the species. And as all the moths are photographed and stored, at least certainly if citizens participate, that means that they can be checked later. And that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind. Experts can even in a few years still check the moths. Of course, coordinators are very important. Just we all know that for butterfly monitoring, coordinators are vital, and that same applies to moth monitoring, where you need somebody to help to coordinate what's going on in the country. However, everybody can participate in the moth monitoring with the butterfly count app, even if you're the only trap in the country. So we tested the moth module in the spring project. So we did comparisons of the numbers of traps and to see what the results were, also what the advantages and disadvantages were. I won't go into all the details. The work was done in the 5 main climate by geographical zones in Europe. Sorry. So we could compare the results. These are the sampling locations. Of course, outside this, there are more sampling locations where people enter the data. For example, you might notice that in Portugal, there is a lot of locations. This is because there is a moth monitoring scheme which enter the data via the butterfly count app and the website for the eBMS. So in the Netherlands, for example, we also have lots of other data. It's become extremely popular. It really exploded. And actually last year, they even had more points than we had for the butterfly transects. So yeah, I'm a little bit worried that they overtake us, but yeah, I'll think of a method to count back. So there is now moth monitoring in these countries. So there is already things going on, and it would be great to expand that over the rest of Europe. Some results show that these are the mean numbers of moths per night in time for the 5 countries for which we tested. You can see that especially Hungary and Spain had very high numbers. And sometimes that was even a problem because there were so many moths, even in the low power trap that we, so the LED traps don't have a lot of power, but even then they had lots of moths inside. So in total, we even collected data on 1,500 species. And most of the species, there were nights with, like I said, in Spain, for example, with 275 moths and 62 species. So, and then it's real work. In the Netherlands, you can see the numbers are much lower, but still you have 10 to 20 traps per night, moths per night on average. Now, the power analysis, it's good to explain that because it's important to answer the question, can we do can we use moth monitoring as part of the pollinator monitoring in Europe? How much would be needed? How much traps and how often should they be deployed to get a real good view on the number of on the changes in the number of moths. So we did this for all the moths, and we used the data of the Dutch monitoring moth monitoring scheme because there is simply a lot of data and it's easily available. So what you can see is there is a color of the line which indicates how many traps that we used. You can see on the x-axis the number of sampling nights, so how many visits per year are done. Of course, it's clear that if you have many traps, you need less visits and the other way around. And how many is needed to detect a significant trend in the total number of moths. In this case, for example, the green line shows you that if you would do 12 visits per year, so that means roughly every 2 weeks in the season, you need about 25 traps in a country like the Netherlands to have a significant trend, to detect a significant trend. Of course, this would not be easily transferable to other countries because they have a much more diverse landscape than the Netherlands, but I think that this will be a reasonable estimate for a biogeographical region. So in more complex countries, I can imagine that you need a few times for each biogeographical region. It might also be different in other biogeographical regions. We could not test that because we didn't have the data. You need data from multiple years to detect trends, but it's one of the things for the future to investigate. But at least it's doable. It's not an endless amount of traps. Nice thing, of course, is that you can use it to calculate trends. This is just the same as with butterflies. In this case, for example, a declining moth, which is a very popular species. And you can see that at least in the numbers, in the Netherlands, the numbers are going down. So, of course, I don't know if I mentioned that moths have a high number of species. Like I said, even in the Netherlands, we have 2,400 species, 800 of them being macro moths. So it's much, much more than the butterflies. And there is now more growing scientific evidence that these are important pollinators. We have tested the method in spring, and I think that the final conclusion is that it works and we can easily roll it out over the rest of Europe. It's very simple. Principally, you use moth traps, you use them the whole night. You can either identify them immediately if you know all the species or you photograph them. That last case, you can identify them by AI, but the photos are also saved, so they can be checked in future. To detect a significant trend, we need something like 25 traps deployed 12 times a year. Can't read this because I somehow problem with oh yeah, there is a website and an app. So the butterfly count app, the same one you might have used for 15-minute counts to enter all the data, goes into the eBMS database. Now my it goes again. Well, principally, we use the same method for trend calculation in the Netherlands as we use for the butterflies. So you can use the moth data very easily to calculate species trends or the trends for all the moths combined. And we can build indicators with them just as we already do for butterflies. These are all methods which we have used for a long time. We have tested them. We know they work. And now we've shown that they also work for moths. And there is actually no reason not to do it. So we can use the moth monitoring. It's ready to be used at a European level. Of course, we need some resources. We need coordinators, validators, traps, etc. Second, again, I cannot see what's a full moth monitoring scheme could be running actually in any year that the EU or the member states would supply us with enough material. Again, it stops. There we go. And it would give trends and indicators which could be used, for example, for the EU biodiversity strategy in 2030. So there is no reason, because the 5 years up to then is enough to calculate trends, at least over those 5 years, or the 6 years, sorry. So this would be actually no problem. The method is there, it's scientifically tested. We can start the monitoring of moth at a European or EU scale, on a national scale, and everything is there. And I end up with a few nice photos. One of the farmers doing his moth trapping with a lot of attention from the ladies, or from the dog guarding the trap. And thanks a lot.